I can still taste the stale beer and cigarette smoke that clung to everything in Murphy's bar that night. The kind of place where the wood was dark from decades of spilled drinks and the felt on the pool table had worn thin in all the familiar spots. It was Thursday, nearly 10 o'clock, and most of the after-work crowd had already drifted home to their families. The television above the bar played some late-night talk show, but the volume was turned down low enough that all you could hear was the distant murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glass against glass. I was chalking my cue when Malcolm appeared across the table from me, rolling his shoulders the way he always did before a game. He had this presence about him that I'd never been able to name, something that made people turn their heads when he walked into a room. Broad shoulders, yes, but it was more than that. There was an ease in how he moved, like he'd never questioned who he was or what he wanted from the world. We'd been meeting like this for 3 weeks now, ever since he'd moved back to town after his divorce. Old friends catching up, that's what I told myself. That's what I told Elise when she asked why I was coming home so late on weeknights. Just two guys shooting pool, talking about the old days, nothing more complicated than that. Malcolm lined up his shot, the white cue ball sitting perfectly under the amber light that hung above the table. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and I found myself watching the way his forearms tensed as he pulled the cue back. There was something hypnotic about the ritual of it, the careful calculation, the moment of suspension before the break. The balls scattered across the felt with that satisfying crack that seems to echo longer than it should. Malcolm straightened up, surveying what he'd accomplished, and I could see the slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He'd always been competitive, even back in college when we'd spend entire evenings at the student union, feeding quarters into machines and pretending we had nowhere else to be. I took my turn, trying to focus on the geometry of the shot rather than the way Malcolm was watching me. There was an intensity to his gaze that made my hands feel unsteady, though I couldn't have explained why. I sank 2 balls in a row, solid colors, and felt a small surge of satisfaction. The game continued like this for several minutes, back and forth, easy banter about work and weather and the changes in our old neighborhood. Safe topics, comfortable distances. The kind of conversation I'd perfected over 20 years of marriage, the art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything. But then something shifted. Malcolm moved closer to line up a difficult corner shot, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of the workshop where he'd been refinishing furniture. His shoulder brushed against mine as he leaned over the table, and I felt something electric run through me, something I'd spent decades learning to ignore. He missed the shot deliberately. I knew because I'd seen him make that same shot 100 times in college. When he straightened up, he was standing closer than necessary, close enough that I could see the flecks of green in his dark eyes. That's when he said it, his voice low enough that even if the bar hadn't been nearly empty, no one else would have heard. Winner gets me. The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my grip tighten on the cue stick, felt something deep in my chest begin to flutter like a bird trying to escape a cage. My mouth went dry. The familiar weight of my wedding ring seemed suddenly unbearable against my finger. I tried to laugh. I could hear myself making the sound, that nervous chuckle I'd perfected whenever conversations ventured too close to dangerous territory. But my hands were shaking now, just slightly, enough that I had to set the cue down on the edge of the table before I dropped it entirely. Malcolm didn't take it back, didn't smile and say he was kidding. He just stood there, patient as stone, waiting for my response to something that felt both inevitable and impossible. The silence stretched between us, filled with 20 years of things I'd never allowed myself to say, never allowed myself to even think. I stared down at the cue ball, perfectly white and still, waiting for my next move. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't do anything except stand there in that dim bar, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 conversations I'd never had the courage to start. The jukebox in the corner clicked and whirred, selecting another song, something slow and melancholy that seemed to underscore the weight of the moment. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the pulse of blood through my temples. Somewhere behind us, a glass clinked against the bar, and the sound seemed to come from very far away. Malcolm waited. He'd always been good at waiting, even back when we were young and everything felt urgent. I remembered late nights in our dorm room when he'd sit on his bed, guitar in his lap, playing the same few chords over and over while I pretended to study. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me in a way that made my stomach flip, but I'd always found reasons to look away, to busy myself with textbooks and assignments and all the careful structures I'd built to keep certain thoughts at bay. Now, 20 years later, those same thoughts were pressing against the walls I'd constructed, threatening to break through. I could feel them there, patient as water finding cracks in stone, wearing away at everything I'd convinced myself was solid and permanent. The cue ball waited, and Malcolm waited, and somewhere in that suspended moment, I felt something inside me begin to fracture. Not break entirely, not yet, but develop those hairline cracks that would eventually split everything wide open. I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, Malcolm's words echoing in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. Winter gets me. The familiar streets of Millfield stretched out before me, lined with houses that all looked variations of the same theme. Modest colonial revivals with front porches and two-car garages, lawns that were maintained but not manicured, lives that were comfortable but not extravagant. My house sat on Maple Street, third from the corner, painted pale blue with white trim that Elise had chosen when we'd bought the place 15 years ago. She'd stood in the paint aisle at Home Depot for nearly an hour, holding up samples against the light, asking my opinion on shades that all looked identical to me. Coastal breeze versus ocean mist. I'd nodded and agreed, the way I'd learned to do, because keeping peace was easier than having preferences. The front porch light was still on when I pulled into the driveway, which meant Elise had waited up. She always did when I came home late, not out of suspicion but out of habit, the way some people leave a light on for safety. Through the living room window, I could see the blue glow of the television and the outline of her figure curled up on the couch, probably watching one of those British mystery shows she favored. Inside, the house smelled like the vanilla candle she lit every evening after dinner, mixed with the lingering aroma of whatever she'd cooked that night. Probably the chicken casserole with the breadcrumb topping that Carter actually ate without complaining. The hardwood floors creaked in all the familiar places as I hung my jacket on the hook by the door, the same hook where my keys went every night, where my wallet and loose change found their designated spots in the small ceramic bowl Carter had made in middle school art class. Elise looked up from her show, muting the sound with the remote. She was wearing her reading glasses and the oversized Cardinals t-shirt she'd inherited from her father, her dark hair pulled back in the messy bun she favored for evenings at home. At 42, she still had the same gentle features that had first caught my attention in college, though there were lines around her eyes now, and something in her expression that hadn't been there when we were young. "How was your evening?" she asked, and I could hear the careful neutrality in her voice. She'd been asking that same question for 3 weeks now, ever since I'd started these Thursday night outings, and each time I detected a note of something I couldn't quite identify. Not suspicion, exactly, but awareness. I told her it was fine, just pool and conversation, the same response I'd given her every time. Malcolm was doing well, adjusting to being back in town, working on some carpentry projects. All true, as far as it went, but I could feel the weight of everything I wasn't saying settling between us like dust. She nodded and turned the volume back up, but I caught her watching me in her peripheral vision as I moved through our nightly routine. Checking the locks on the front door, turning off the porch light, filling a glass with water from the kitchen sink. These small rituals that had once felt comfortable now seemed performative, like I was playing the role of a man coming home to his family rather than actually being that man. Upstairs, Carter's door was closed, but I could see the strip of light underneath and hear the faint sound of music coming from his headphones. He was 16 now, caught in that strange territory between childhood and whatever came next, spending most of his time in his room, working on college applications or talking to friends on social media platforms I barely understood. When he did emerge for meals or family time, he moved through our house like a visitor, polite but distracted, already half gone to some future we couldn't share. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of our life together. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the soft murmur of Elise's television program, the distant whisper of traffic on the main road that ran behind our neighborhood. All of it familiar, all of it exactly as it should be. But something had shifted after that moment in the bar, something fundamental that I couldn't name or understand. It was as if I'd been living my life through a sheet of glass, and now there was a crack running through it, distorting everything I'd thought I could see clearly. In our bedroom, I went through the motions of getting ready for sleep, hanging my clothes in the closet where they belonged, brushing my teeth with the same toothpaste we'd been buying for years, setting my phone on the nightstand next to the lamp with the shade that matched our comforter. Elise was already under the covers when I slipped in beside her, and she murmured good night without turning toward me. I lay there in the darkness, listening to her breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep, and tried to make sense of what was happening to me. I'd built this life so carefully, brick by brick, decision by decision. The teaching position at Millfield High School, where I'd worked for 18 years, where students knew me as Mr. Mercer, the guy who made history interesting, who coached JV baseball in the spring and never missed a faculty meeting. The house where every room reflected choices we'd made together, where family photos lined the hallway and our wedding picture still sat on Elise's dresser. The routines that carried us from morning to night, season to season, year after year. It was a good life, a solid life, the kind of life that looked exactly right from the outside, and most of the time it felt right from the inside too. I loved Elise, in the way that people love each other after 20 years of marriage, with familiarity and fondness and shared history. I was proud of Carter, proud of the thoughtful young man he was becoming. I found satisfaction in my work, in the moments when I could see understanding dawn in a student's eyes, when I could make the past feel relevant to their present. But lying there in the dark, I couldn't shake the memory of Malcolm's voice, low and certain, offering something I'd never allowed myself to want. Winter gets me. And beneath those words, the recognition of something I'd been avoiding for so long that I'd almost convinced myself it didn't exist. Malcolm Reyes had been my roommate junior and senior year at State, back when we were both figuring out who we wanted to be in the world. He was studying art then, always working on some project or another, filling our dorm room with the smell of paint and charcoal and possibility. I was already set on teaching, drawn to history because it felt safe, because the past was fixed and knowable in ways the future wasn't. We'd been close in the way that young men sometimes are, sharing late-night conversations about everything and nothing, comfortable silences that stretched between us like bridges. There had been moments, fleeting glimpses of something more, but I'd always found ways to redirect, to step back, to focus on safer ground. Malcolm had graduated and moved to Portland, married a woman named Sarah, started a furniture-making business, lived the kind of life that seemed to exist in a different universe from mine. And now he was back, divorced and unattached, living in a small apartment downtown, and working with his hands the way he always had. He'd found me through social media, sent a message suggesting we catch up, and I'd said yes without thinking about what it might mean or what it might awaken. Thursday nights became my anchor point, the thing I looked forward to through the mundane rhythm of lesson plans and parent conferences and faculty meetings that seemed to stretch longer each week. I started leaving school earlier, telling my colleagues I had papers to grade at home, then driving the long way to Murphy's Bar so I could have a few extra minutes to prepare myself for whatever version of myself I became when I was with Malcolm. The second Thursday, I arrived before him and ordered a beer I didn't particularly want, just to have something to do with my hands. When he walked in, scanning the room until he found me, something in my chest loosened in a way I hadn't expected. He wore a different shirt each week, but they all fit him the same way, casual and confident, like he'd never spent time in front of a mirror wondering if he looked like the person he was trying to be. We played pool, and I began to notice things I'd missed the first night. The way he chalked his cue with deliberate precision. How he'd pause before difficult shots, not from uncertainty, but from some internal calculation I couldn't follow. The brief moment of satisfaction that crossed his face when the balls fell exactly where he'd intended them to go. These small revelations felt significant in ways I couldn't explain, like I was learning a language I'd forgotten I once knew. The third Thursday, he bought the first round, and I found myself telling him about Carter's college applications, about how my son had grown into this thoughtful young man who seemed to see the world more clearly than I ever had at his age. Malcolm listened with genuine attention, asked questions that showed he was actually hearing what I said, not just waiting for his turn to speak. When I mentioned Carter's interest in environmental science, Malcolm smiled and said it figured that my kid would want to save the world. By the fourth week, I stopped pretending these meetings were coincidental. I started making excuses at home that felt increasingly elaborate. Faculty committee meetings that didn't exist. Curriculum planning sessions that I scheduled in my own mind. Parent conferences that I stretched into entire evenings. Elise would nod and wish me luck, and I could see her trying not to ask too many questions, though I caught her watching me sometimes with a puzzled expression, as if she were trying to solve a problem she couldn't quite define. It was on the sixth Thursday that Malcolm suggested the fishing trip. We were finishing our second game, and I was lining up what should have been an easy shot, but somehow kept missing. He was leaning against the wall, cue stick propped beside him, and he mentioned almost casually that he'd been thinking about getting out of town for a weekend, maybe driving up to Lake Hartwell where we used to go during college. "Do you remember that place we found?" he asked. "The little cove where nobody else ever seemed to fish?" I did remember. I remembered it so clearly that I could almost smell the pine needles and feel the morning mist rising off the water. We discovered it during our senior year, during one of those spontaneous road trips that felt possible when you were 21 and convinced that time was infinite. He said he'd rented a small cabin, nothing fancy, just a place to get away from everything for a couple of days. He looked at me directly when he extended the invitation, and I could feel that same electric charge I'd experienced the first night, that sense of standing at the edge of something I couldn't name. I should have said no immediately, should have made some excuse about family obligations or work responsibilities. Instead, I heard myself saying I'd think about it, which we both knew meant yes. At home that night, I mentioned the trip to Elise while we were cleaning up after dinner. I kept my voice casual, called it a guy's weekend, something about reconnecting with an old friend. She raised an eyebrow, not suspicious exactly but surprised, because I'd never been the type to take spontaneous trips anywhere. "When was the last time you went fishing?" she asked, and I realized I couldn't remember. Carter looked up from his homework long enough to say it sounded cool, that he thought it was good I was doing something fun for myself. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten with guilt I couldn't explain. Elise smiled and said she thought it was a great idea, that I'd been working too hard lately and could use some time to relax. Their easy acceptance felt like both a blessing and an accusation. The drive to Lake Hartwell took 2 hours through countryside that grew progressively quieter and greener. Malcolm had offered to pick me up, but I'd insisted on meeting him there, needing the time alone to think or maybe to avoid thinking. I packed light, threw some old clothes and fishing gear into a duffel bag, kissed Elise goodbye with what I hoped looked like normal enthusiasm. The cabin was exactly what Malcolm had described, small and simple, perched on a hill overlooking the water with a dock that extended into the lake like a wooden finger pointing towards something I couldn't see. Malcolm was already there when I arrived, sitting on the front porch with a beer in his hand and that easy smile that had always made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We spent the afternoon on the water, not talking much, letting the gentle motion of the boat and the repetitive rhythm of casting and reeling create a kind of meditation. I felt something in my shoulders release that I hadn't realized was tense, some knot of anxiety that had been living there for months or maybe years. The sun was warm without being oppressive, and the air smelled like pine and possibility. Malcolm caught 3 fish to my 1, but he didn't gloat about it the way he might have when we were younger. Instead, he showed me a different technique for reading the water, explained how to recognize where the fish might be hiding based on shadows and current patterns. His voice was patient and instructive, and I found myself watching his hands as he demonstrated different knots, remembering how those same hands used to sketch and paint and create things that seemed to appear from nowhere. That evening, we built a fire in the stone circle behind the cabin and cooked our fish with vegetables Malcolm had brought from town. The meal was simple but tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months, maybe because of the setting or maybe because of the company. As darkness settled around us, the fire became our entire world, crackling and shifting, throwing shadows that danced across Malcolm's face. He started telling stories about our college days, things I'd forgotten or convinced myself weren't important. The time we'd driven to Nashville on a whim to see some band neither of us had heard of, ending up at an all-night diner at 3 in the morning, talking about our dreams and fears with the kind of honesty that only seemed possible in fluorescent light and exhaustion. The night we'd stayed up until dawn working on a history paper I was convinced would fail, Malcolm helping me organize my thoughts even though he had his own projects due the next week. "You were always so worried about everything," he said, stirring the fire with a long stick until sparks rose into the night sky. "Like you thought if you planned hard enough, you could control how everything would turn out." I told him that hadn't changed much, and he laughed, but not unkindly. The fire settled into steady flames, and we fell into one of those comfortable silences that had always existed between us. I was aware of the warmth radiating from the logs, the sound of water lapping gently against the dock below, the vast darkness of the lake stretching out beyond the reach of our small circle of light. That's when Malcolm shifted closer, not dramatically, but enough that I could feel the warmth of his shoulder almost touching mine. He turned slightly toward me, and in the firelight I could see the serious expression that had replaced his earlier smile. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to wonder what would have happened if we'd been braver back then. If either of us had been brave enough to say what we were both thinking." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I felt that same fracturing sensation I'd experienced at the pool table, as if something fundamental was breaking apart inside me. The fire popped and settled, sending another shower of sparks toward the stars, and I realized that all my careful planning, all my structured life, had led me here anyway, to this moment I'd been avoiding for 20 years. I didn't answer Malcolm that night by the fire, couldn't find words for what his question had awakened in me. Instead, I stared into the flames until my eyes watered, using the smoke as an excuse for the tears that threatened to spill over. Eventually, we let the fire die down to glowing embers, and I retreated to my side of the small cabin, lying awake on unfamiliar sheets while Malcolm's breathing settled into sleep just a few feet away. But something had shifted during those quiet hours by the water. Some internal wall had developed a crack that would only widen with time. I drove home Sunday evening with the windows down, trying to clear my head of pine smoke and the memory of Malcolm's voice asking questions I'd never allowed myself to consider. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the same as when I'd left it, but I felt like I was seeing it through different eyes. Elise greeted me with genuine warmth, asking about the fishing and whether I'd caught anything worth bragging about. I showed her the photos on my phone, Malcolm and me holding up our modest catch, both of us grinning like we'd landed trophy base instead of a few small perch. She smiled and said it looked like I'd had a good time, that I seemed more relaxed than I'd been in months. If only she knew what kind of relaxation I'd found. Carter wandered into the kitchen while I was unpacking my gear, curious about the trip in the way teenagers sometimes are when they catch their parents doing something unexpected. He asked if Malcolm was the friend from college I'd mentioned before, and when I nodded, he said it was cool that we'd stayed in touch all these years. The innocent assumption in his voice, that this was just a normal reconnection between old friends, made my chest tighten with guilt. That night, lying beside Elise in our familiar bed, I found myself replaying every moment of the weekend. The way Malcolm had looked when he talked about our college days, the casual brush of his hand against mine when he'd shown me the fishing knot, the question by the firelight that had opened a door I'd kept locked for decades. I turned toward Elise, studying her profile in the dim light filtering through our curtains, and felt a strange combination of love and loss that I couldn't explain. She was beautiful in the quiet way that deepens over time, her features softened by sleep, her dark hair spread across the pillow we'd bought together when we'd first moved into this house. I loved her, had always loved her, but lying there in the darkness, I realized I'd never felt for her the kind of electric awareness I'd experienced sitting beside Malcolm by the lake. The realization should have terrified me more than it did. Our Thursday night pool games resumed the following week, but something fundamental had changed. The easy banter felt charged with undercurrents I couldn't ignore, every casual touch or shared laugh carrying weight that seemed disproportionate to the moment. Malcolm didn't mention the fishing trip or his fireside question, but I could feel it hanging between us like a bridge neither of us was quite ready to cross. I started paying attention to things I'd been unconsciously avoiding. The way Malcolm's eyes followed me when I moved around the pool table. How he found excuses to stand closer than necessary. Our shoulders brushing when he leaned in to show me a shot or point out an angle I'd missed. The way conversations would trail off into comfortable silences that felt intimate in ways I'd never experienced with anyone else. At home, I became a master of divided attention. I helped Carter with his college essays while thinking about the sound of Malcolm's laugh. I listened to Elise talk about her day at the real estate office while replaying the moment Malcolm had touched my arm to get my attention. I graded papers and planned lessons and maintained all the routines of my regular life. But underneath it all was this constant hum of anticipation, as if I were waiting for something I couldn't name. The small betrayals began to accumulate. Standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing dinner dishes while Elise dried, I would find myself thinking about Malcolm's hands instead of focusing on her voice as she told me about a difficult client or a house that wouldn't sell. Sitting at Carter's baseball games, cheering when he got a hit, but distracted by memories of Malcolm describing the furniture he was building, the satisfaction he found in working with wood, creating something beautiful and functional from raw materials. I started making excuses to drive past the downtown area where Malcolm lived, just to see his truck parked outside the small apartment complex he'd chosen. I never stopped, never even slowed down, but these brief glimpses became a kind of sustenance, proof that he existed in the same world I inhabited, breathing the same air, living his life in proximity to mine. Our Thursday meetings stretched longer each week. What had started as quick games of pool evolved into extended conversations that carried us well past the bar's usual closing time. Murphy, the owner, seemed content to let us stay as long as we kept buying drinks, and I found myself ordering beer I didn't want just to prolong these evenings that had become the most honest hours of my week. Malcolm told me about his divorce, not with bitterness, but with the kind of clear-eyed assessment that comes after enough time has passed to see patterns clearly. Sarah had been a good person, he said, but they'd wanted different things from life, different definitions of happiness and success. He'd realized he'd been trying to become the version of himself she needed rather than figuring out who he actually was. When he turned the question back to me, asking about my marriage, I found myself giving answers that surprised us both. I told him about the comfortable distance that had grown between Elise and me, not from any failure on either of our parts, but from a kind of gentle erosion, like water wearing away stone, so gradually you don't notice until you step back and see how much has changed. He listened without judgment, without offering advice or solutions, and I realized how rare it was to have someone simply witness your confusion without trying to fix it. With Elise, conversations about our relationship felt like problem-solving sessions, both of us trying to identify issues and implement solutions. With Malcolm, I could simply exist in the uncertainty, let it breathe without rushing toward resolution. One Thursday in late October, after we'd been meeting for nearly 3 months, something shifted again. We were playing our usual game, but the competitive element had almost disappeared. We moved around the table like dancers following familiar choreography, less concerned with winning than with prolonging the ritual that brought us together each week. Malcolm made a shot and straightened up, but instead of moving away from the table, he stayed close, chalk in one hand, cue in the other, looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the patient waiting he'd shown by the campfire, but something more immediate, more present. "You know this isn't just about pool anymore," he said quietly, and his voice carried the same careful neutrality he'd used when asking about my marriage. It wasn't a question or a demand, just an acknowledgement of what we both already knew. I set my cue down on the felt and looked at him directly, probably the first time I'd done so, without immediately glancing away. He was right, of course. These Thursday nights had become something else entirely, a weekly appointment with a version of myself I'd never allowed to fully exist. "I know," I said, and in those two words was an admission that felt larger than the small bar could contain. Malcolm nodded, as if I'd confirmed something he'd been waiting to hear. He didn't smile or move closer or do anything dramatic. He simply continued the game, but the air between us had changed, become electric in a way that made every subsequent touch of chalk to cue, every brush of fabric as we moved around each other, feel significant. Driving home that night, I realized I was no longer just spending time with an old friend. I was falling in love, had probably been falling for weeks without letting myself recognize what was happening. The knowledge should have sent me into panic, should have made me want to end these meetings and retreat to the safety of my established life. Instead, I felt more awake than I had in years, as if I'd been holding my breath for decades and was finally learning how to fill my lungs completely. But with that awakening came a deeper awareness of what I was risking. At home, Elise was waiting up as usual, curled on the couch with her mystery novel and a cup of tea that had gone cold while she read. She looked up when I came in, and I saw something in her expression I'd been trying not to notice, a kind of patient sadness that suggested she knew something was changing even if she couldn't identify what. "How was your evening?" she asked, the same question she'd been asking for months. But tonight I heard the weight behind it, the careful way she was trying not to ask what she really wanted to know. I gave her the same response I always did, but for the first time, the lie felt heavy in my mouth, substantial enough that I worried she might taste it when I kissed her goodnight. She smiled and said she was glad I was enjoying these nights out with Malcolm, that it was good for me to have that kind of friendship. Her kindness felt like an accusation, a reminder of everything I was jeopardizing for the sake of feelings I couldn't control and wasn't sure I wanted to. Upstairs, I stood in the hallway outside Carter's room, listening to the quiet sounds of him moving around, getting ready for bed. Tomorrow he had a chemistry test he'd been studying for all week, and Saturday there was a college fair he wanted to attend. His life was moving forward with the kind of purposeful momentum I'd once had, and I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness toward his certainty, his clear sense of direction. In our bedroom, I went through my nightly routine with mechanical precision, but my mind was still at Murphy's bar, still caught in that moment when Malcolm had acknowledged what we both knew was happening between us. I brushed my teeth and wondered what it would feel like to kiss him. I changed into pajamas and imagined what it would be like to wake up beside him instead of Elise. These thoughts should have felt like betrayal, and in some ways they did. But they also felt like the first honest desires I'd allowed myself to experience in years, as if I'd been sleepwalking through my own life and was finally beginning to wake up. The question was whether I was brave enough to stay awake, or if I would find some way to slip back into the comfortable unconsciousness that had carried me this far. The weeks that followed our acknowledgement felt like living in a house of cards, every movement careful and calculated to avoid bringing everything crashing down. At home, I moved through my routines with increasing difficulty, each familiar gesture feeling more like performance than life. Elise would catch me staring out windows at nothing, ask if I was feeling all right, and I would manufacture smiles and explanations about work stress or seasonal allergies, anything to deflect the growing concern in her eyes. Carter was deep in the college application process, and I threw myself into helping him with an intensity that surprised us both. We spent hours at the kitchen table working on essays about his hopes and dreams, his vision for his future, and I found myself envying his clarity, his certainty about who he was becoming. When he wrote about wanting to study environmental science to help preserve the natural world, his words carried a conviction I wasn't sure I'd ever possessed about anything. At school, my colleagues began commenting on how distracted I seemed. During faculty meetings, I would find myself thinking about Malcolm's hands instead of listening to discussions about standardized test scores. While teaching the Revolutionary War, I would lose my thread mid-sentence, distracted by memories of Thursday night conversations about art and craftsmanship and the satisfaction of creating something meaningful with your own hands. The Thursday nights themselves had become almost unbearably tense. We still played pool, but the games felt secondary to the conversation happening beneath the surface. All the things we weren't quite saying, but both understood perfectly. Malcolm would make a shot, and our eyes would meet across the table. And in those moments I felt like I was drowning and being rescued simultaneously. It was early December when everything finally broke apart. The bar was nearly empty that night, just us and an older man nursing a whiskey at the far end, lost in his own thoughts. Even Murphy had retreated to the back office, leaving us essentially alone with the soft glow of the beer's signs and the familiar weight of unspoken truth. We'd been playing for about an hour, but neither of us was really concentrating on the game. Malcolm missed shots I'd seen him make effortlessly before, and I found myself gripping my cue so tightly my knuckles were white. The tension that had been building for months felt ready to snap, like a wire stretched beyond its capacity. Malcolm lined up what should have been a simple shot, paused, then straightened up without taking it. He walked around to where I was standing and leaned against the wall, studying my face with an expression I couldn't read. "This is killing you, isn't it?" he said quietly, and his voice carried a gentleness that made my chest tighten. I tried to laugh it off, the same deflection I'd perfected over the years, but the sound came out hollow and unconvincing. I could feel something building inside me, a pressure that had been accumulating for weeks, maybe years, and I wasn't sure I could contain it much longer. Malcolm pushed himself off the wall and took a step closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with the workshop scent that always clung to his clothes. He didn't touch me, but his presence felt like a hand on my shoulder, steady and patient. "What are you so afraid of, Julian?" he asked, and his use of my name, spoken with such careful tenderness, broke something inside me that I'd been holding together through sheer force of will. The cue stick slipped from my hands and clattered against the side of the table. I tried to catch it, but my coordination had abandoned me completely, and I ended up gripping the edge of the table instead, my knuckles white against the dark wood. "Everything," I whispered, and the word came out cracked and raw. "I'm afraid of everything." The admission opened a floodgate I'd kept sealed for decades. Standing there in that dim bar with Malcolm waiting patiently for whatever I needed to say, 20 years of carefully constructed pretense began to crumble. I told him about the mornings when I woke up beside Elise and felt like a stranger in my own life, going through motions that belonged to someone else. About watching Carter grow into this confident young man who seemed to know exactly who he was, while I still felt like I was playing a role I'd never auditioned for. About standing in front of my classes talking about historical figures who had changed the world, when I'd never had the courage to change anything about my own existence. I told him about the nights I lay awake wondering what would have happened if I'd been honest about who I was when we were young, if I'd been brave enough to acknowledge the feelings I'd spent so much energy denying. About the way I'd chosen safety over truth at every turn, building a life that looked right from the outside, while feeling increasingly hollow within. The words poured out of me in a whisper that felt like shouting, everything I'd never said to anyone, not even myself. I told him about the loneliness that had become so familiar I'd stopped recognizing it as anything unusual, about the way I'd learned to split myself in two, the public Julian who taught and coached and attended parent-teacher conferences, and the hidden Julian who ached for something he couldn't name and couldn't have. I told him about the guilt, how every moment of happiness I found in his company felt like stealing from Elise and Carter, how I convinced myself for months that I could maintain some kind of balance, keep both worlds separate and functional. But the weight of living divided had become impossible to bear, and I felt like I was disappearing, becoming transparent even to myself. When the words finally stopped, I was gripping the edge of the pool table so hard my hands were shaking. I couldn't look at Malcolm, couldn't bear to see whatever expression might be on his face after witnessing this complete collapse of everything I'd tried to be. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the low hum of the beer cooler behind the bar. I expected Malcolm to say something, offer some kind of advice or consolation, maybe suggest I talk to a therapist or take some time to figure things out. Instead, He reached across the narrow space between us and placed his hand over mine where it clutched the table's edge. His palm was warm and calloused from his work, and the simple contact sent a shock through my entire system, as if I'd been holding my breath underwater and had finally surfaced. He didn't try to pry my fingers loose or pull me away from the table. He just covered my hand with his, a gesture so gentle and undemanding that it somehow conveyed more understanding than any words could have managed. In that touch was acceptance of everything I'd just confessed, acknowledgement of the fear and confusion and longing that had been eating away at me for months. I finally looked up and found him watching me with an expression of such compassion that it nearly broke me all over again. There was no judgment in his face, no disappointment or impatience, just the kind of steady presence I'd been craving without knowing how to ask for it. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight," he said quietly, his thumb moving slightly against my knuckle. "But you also don't have to keep pretending that none of this matters." The old man at the end of the bar finished his drink and left, his footsteps echoing briefly before the door swung shut behind him. Murphy emerged from his office to check the register, glanced at us standing close together by the pool table, and discreetly returned to his paperwork without comment. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I could breathe completely. The terrible pressure in my chest had eased, not disappeared but become manageable, like a weight I could finally acknowledge instead of pretending it wasn't there. Malcolm's hand stayed on mine for another moment, then withdrew slowly, leaving me with the lingering warmth of connection and the understanding that something fundamental had shifted between us. We didn't play any more pool that night. Instead, we talked until Murphy finally announced last call, and even then we lingered in the parking lot, reluctant to end this evening that had changed everything. I thought the confession would bring relief, that finally acknowledging the truth to Malcolm would somehow make everything easier. Instead, it ushered in a period of almost unbearable awareness. Every moment at home felt like I was wearing a mask that no longer fit properly, and I could sense that mask slipping with each passing day. Elise began watching me with a different kind of attention, not the casual observation of a wife checking in on her husband's mood, but something more focused, more concerned. She would pause in the middle of conversations when she noticed my mind had wandered, ask questions about my day that seemed designed to catch inconsistencies in my responses. I tried to compensate by being more present, more attentive, but my efforts felt forced and obvious. I would ask about her real estate clients with exaggerated interest, offer to help with household tasks I'd never shown concern for before, bring home flowers for no particular reason. These gestures, meant to reassure her, seemed to have the opposite effect, making her even more suspicious that something was wrong. Carter began avoiding me in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. He would finish dinner quickly and retreat to his room, claiming homework that couldn't wait. When I offered to help with his college essays, he would find reasons to work on them when I wasn't home or ask Elise for assistance instead. During our few remaining conversations, he would study my face with an expression I couldn't read, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he didn't fully understand. The guilt became a constant companion, a weight in my chest that made even simple interactions feel fraudulent. When Elise would kiss me goodbye in the morning, I found myself calculating how many hours until I could see Malcolm again. When Carter would mention something about his future plans, I would wonder if I would be part of his life to see them unfold. My Thursday night meetings with Malcolm continued, but they had taken on a different quality after my breakdown at the pool table. We talked more openly about the impossible situation I was in, the choice that seemed to have no good options. Malcolm never pressured me, never suggested that I should leave my family or make any dramatic changes. Instead, he simply existed as a constant reminder of what authenticity might feel like. But living in this state of suspension was becoming impossible. I was failing everyone, including myself. At school, my performance had deteriorated to the point where the principal called me into his office to ask if everything was all right at home. I'd managed to deflect his concerns, but I could see he wasn't entirely convinced by my explanations. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in mid-December. I had told Elise I was staying late to help a struggling student. But instead I had driven to Malcolm's apartment complex and sat in the parking lot for nearly an hour, not brave enough to go up to his door, but unable to drive away either. By the time I got home, dinner was cold and both Elise and Carter had eaten without me. Elise was loading the dishwasher when I walked into the kitchen, her movements precise and controlled in a way that suggested barely contained emotion. Carter was at the kitchen table supposedly doing homework, but I could tell he was listening to our conversation from the way his pencil had stopped moving across the page. I apologized for being late, offered the same excuse about helping a student that was becoming my default explanation for everything. Elise continued loading dishes without looking at me, and the silence stretched long enough that even Carter glanced up from his textbook. Finally, she closed the dishwasher with more force than necessary and turned to face me. Her expression was calm, but I could see something fierce and determined in her eyes that I'd never seen before. "We need to talk," she said quietly, and her tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Carter immediately gathered his books and headed toward the stairs, but not before I caught the worried look he gave both of us. The sound of his bedroom door closing felt like the final bell in a boxing match, signaling that whatever was about to happen would determine everything that came after. Elise sat down at the kitchen table where Carter had been working, folding her hands in front of her with the careful composure she used when she was trying not to lose control. I remained standing, unable to commit to sitting down, as if staying mobile might somehow help me escape what I could sense coming. "Julian," she said, and something in the way she spoke my name told me that pretending was no longer an option. "I know something is going on with you. I've known for months, but I kept hoping it would work itself out, that whatever you were going through would pass." I started to protest, to offer another explanation, but she held up her hand to stop me. "Please don't lie to me anymore," she said, and her voice carried a weariness that made my chest tighten with shame. "I've been your wife for 20 years. I know when you're not really here, when your mind is somewhere else entirely." The kitchen suddenly felt too small. The familiar space where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations now transformed into something that felt like a courtroom. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, marking time that felt like it was running out. Elise looked at me for a long moment, studying my face with the kind of attention she usually reserved for evaluating properties she was considering listing. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but quiet. "Who is he, Julian?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with the certainty of someone who had been putting pieces together for weeks and had finally seen the complete picture. The 3 words landed between us like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread until they reached every corner of our life together. I felt something collapse inside me, some final wall of pretense that I'd been maintaining through sheer force of will. My legs gave out, and I found myself sitting across from her, my hands flat on the table between us, staring at the wood grain I'd looked at thousands of times before but never really seen. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, but I couldn't find words that would make any of this better or easier. How do you explain to someone who has loved you faithfully for 2 decades that you've been living as half a person the entire time, that everything they thought they knew about you was built on a foundation of self-deception? "Malcolm," I whispered finally, his name feeling strange in this kitchen where it had never been spoken before. Elise nodded, as if I'd confirmed something she'd already known. She didn't ask how long or why or what this meant for our future. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with an expression that was sadness and resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. "I always wondered," she said quietly, "why there was this part of you that I could never quite reach. I used to think it was just because you were private, that everyone had pieces of themselves they kept separate. But it was more than that, wasn't it?" I couldn't speak, could barely breathe, but I managed to nod. Above us, I could hear Carter moving around in his room, probably trying to pretend he hadn't heard anything. But the footsteps seemed slower than usual, more deliberate, as if he were processing something he couldn't fully understand. The tears came then, not dramatically but steadily, running down my face as I sat across from the woman I'd built my entire adult life with, finally admitting what we'd both known was true, but had never been brave enough to say aloud. Elise reached across the table and touched my hand, the same gesture Malcolm had made at the pool table, but coming from her it felt like forgiveness and goodbye at the same time. "I'm not angry," she said, and I could tell she was surprised by the truth of it. "I should be, but I'm not. I'm just tired of pretending that everything is fine when it obviously isn't." We sat there in the kitchen where we'd planned Carter's birthday parties and discussed college savings and dreamed about retirement trips we'd never take together. And I understood that our marriage was ending not with anger or accusations, but with the quiet acknowledgement that love isn't always enough to bridge the gap between who we are and who we've tried to be. The question now was what came next, and whether I was finally ready to choose the terrifying honesty of being myself over the comfortable safety of the life I'd built on pretense. The conversation with Elise didn't end that night. It continued in fragments over the following days, quiet discussions after Carter left for school, or late in the evening when exhaustion made honesty easier than pretense. We talked about practical things, logistical concerns, but underneath it all was the shared understanding that we were dismantling 20 years of shared life with the same careful attention we'd once used to build it. Carter knew something fundamental was shifting. He moved through the house with the cautious awareness of someone navigating unstable ground, asking fewer questions than usual, spending more time at friends' houses or in his room. The few times we found ourselves alone together, he would study my face with an expression that was part confusion, part concern, and part something that might have been disappointment. I wanted to explain to him that this wasn't about love lost or promises broken, that sometimes being true to yourself requires dismantling everything you've built on falsehood. But he was 17, focused on his own future, and I wasn't sure he needed to carry the weight of understanding choices that had taken me decades to make. Elise and I agreed I would wait until after the holidays to move out. It seemed cruel to upend everything during Christmas, particularly Carter's last Christmas at home before college. So we maintained the facade for 3 more weeks, decorating the tree together, exchanging gifts, hosting my parents for dinner, all of us playing our parts in what we knew would be our final performance as a complete family. On January 3rd, a gray Tuesday morning when Carter had returned to school and Elise had an early appointment with clients, I packed a single suitcase. It felt strange, reducing a lifetime to one bag, but I found I didn't want much from this house that had never quite felt like home. A few changes of clothes, some books, photographs of Carter at various ages, the watch my father had given me when I graduated college. The house was silent except for the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. I moved through rooms where I'd lived for 15 years, seeing them as if for the first time, or perhaps the last time with any claim to belonging. The living room where we'd watched Carter take his first steps. The kitchen table where we'd helped him with homework and planned family vacations we'd thought would continue forever. I paused at the photographs lining the hallway. Images of birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that had seemed significant enough to preserve. There was our wedding day, both of us so young and certain about the future we were choosing. Carter's first day of kindergarten, gap-toothed and excited. Family portraits from various years, all of us smiling with the confidence that this was permanent, that love and good intentions were enough to sustain anything. These moments had been real, I reminded myself. The happiness in those photographs wasn't false, even if it was incomplete. I had loved Elise, did love her still, just not in the way she deserved to be loved. I was proud of Carter, would always be his father regardless of where I lived or who I loved. These truths could coexist with the choice I was making. In our bedroom, I stood for a moment looking at the bed we'd shared for so many years, the nightstand where my reading glasses still lay next to the lamp Elise had chosen to match our comforter. Everything in this room reflected compromises and shared decisions, the gradual accumulation of a life built together. I slipped my wedding ring from my finger, feeling the slight indentation it had worn into my skin over 2 decades. The gold caught the morning light filtering through our curtains, and I found myself remembering the day Elise had slipped it onto my hand, both of us making promises we'd meant completely at the time. Downstairs, Elise was waiting in the kitchen doorway when I came down with my suitcase. She was dressed for work, professional and composed, but I could see the careful control in her posture, the way she held herself as if any sudden movement might cause her to break apart. She didn't say anything as I set the ring on the kitchen counter where we'd eaten breakfast together countless mornings, where we'd discussed Carter's grades and planned weekend activities and maintained the gentle rhythms of married life. The metallic clink as it touched the surface seemed too loud in the quiet house. "I'm sorry," I said, though the words felt inadequate for everything I was apologizing for. Sorry for the years of half-truths and emotional absence. Sorry for not being brave enough to face this sooner. Sorry for the pain my choice would cause her and Carter, even though staying would have been its own kind of cruelty. She nodded, understanding that this wasn't really about apology or forgiveness, but about finally choosing truth over comfort. Her eyes were bright with tears she wasn't allowing to fall, at least not while I was still there to witness them. "Take care of yourself, Julian," she said quietly, and in those 4 words was both goodbye and blessing, the kind of grace I wasn't sure I deserved but was grateful to receive. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the front door, pausing once to look back at the woman who had been my partner through my 20s and 30s, who had given me a son I would always love, who deserved so much more than the divided heart I'd been able to offer her. Outside, Malcolm was waiting in his truck at the curb, engine running, not presumptuous enough to park in the driveway, but close enough that I wouldn't have to walk far carrying the remnants of my old life toward whatever came next. He didn't smile when he saw me, didn't reach across to open the passenger door, just nodded with the kind of quiet acknowledgement that suggested he understood the weight of what I was leaving behind. I climbed into the truck and set my suitcase in the back, then settled into the passenger seat as Malcolm pulled away from the house where I'd lived as half a person for 15 years. In the side mirror, I watched it grow smaller until it disappeared around a corner, taking with it the safety and certainty I'd traded for the possibility of living as myself. Malcolm didn't ask where I wanted to go or what came next. He simply drove, and I stared out at the horizon stretching ahead of us, unsure whether I was running toward freedom or exile, but breathing for the first time in decades like a man who had finally chosen truth over pretense. The morning air felt different somehow, sharper and more real, as if I'd been living underwater and had finally broken through to the surface. I didn't know what would happen next, couldn't predict how Carter would adjust or whether Elise would find the happiness she deserved with someone who could love her completely. But I knew I was finally, terrifyingly myself.